Good day, everyone. Today we'll be taking a look at my first full clear of the new Floor 12 in the Spiral Abyss, with a bit of commentary. Now, the first chamber is pretty easy. There really isn't anything too particularly nasty. In the first half, having an Anemo character to gather the Nibushi and then the 3 Pyro agents is definitely very nice and will drastically decrease the time it will take for you to clear this half. The only one major annoyance is the Pyro infusion, which one means you probably don't want to bring a Pyro character to this half. You certainly still can, but considering also that the Pyro agents have like 50% Pyro resistance, it'd be probably better to bring some other elemental type. And because they get infused by an element, it makes them significantly more difficult to control, as you can't really crowd control them while they are under those effects. So you'll want to try and definitely get rid of those infusions, gather them together, and then AoE them all down. For the second half, unlike the first half, Pyro is very good for, as pretty much all the enemies here you'll get either free vaporizes or melts upon. And so if you have a strong Pyro team, it probably makes more sense to throw them in this half. But aside from that, again, there really isn't much to say here. I would kind of, generally speaking, go for the Geovishap and let the water animals come to you, and then just AoE them all down. A Cryo character could also make this half significantly easier by freezing the water animals. However, the second Geovishap infuses with Cryo, and so if you do bring some sort of Cryo freeze team to this half, you'll want to try to make sure to kill the second Geovishap before he can get his Cryo infusion. But again, aside from all that, Chamber 1, for the most part, is pretty straightforward, and I would highly suggest not bringing a power character for the first chamber and bringing a power character for the second. Getting into Chamber 2, we have, by this time, our familiar Magu-Kenki, of which by this point there isn't a whole lot to say, and so we can instead talk about the ley line disorders and how, especially with this fight, you might try to abuse it. Seeing as the Magu-Kenki takes about 10 seconds before you can damage him anyway, I feel you might as well use those 10 seconds to sit on your main DPS, if that is what you are currently using, and make sure that they have above 50% energy, so that they can gain those stacks of the attack buff, so that you can, say, like with Ayaka, throw out her ultimate, while not really needing to use anyone else's buffs and so on, and so can keep them for the second phase, while quickly getting through the first. Now, we can also use this time to talk a little bit about the team. Looking at the enemies in here from the beginning, instead of throwing Diona in here, I decided to try Rosaria, as it didn't really look like I would have a tremendous need for healing, as long as I wasn't incredibly silly and getting hit by attacks, which I shouldn't, which was definitely occurring. However, this can be a little bit difficult for the final chamber, actually, as the mechanical array type enemies can throw out attacks that are kind of difficult to avoid, even if they don't do much damage individually. Without having any healer at all, it does kind of add up a little bit. So just for that, you might want to use a healer. However, with the first half, there are some things we can do to bait out some attacks so that we don't take the full brunt of them. Now, for the second half of the second chamber, it's very similar to the prior second half, where we will have a Cryo Assassin Mage and a Mirror Maiden. However, there are a few additional enemies, and instead of having them all at the same time, we have them in waves. So this half isn't any more difficult, but it is definitely more time-consuming, especially if you kind of mess up your rotations. But it's still easily doable, even if you do mess up said rotations. So if you were to use a team now in this half that had an Anemo character that could gather the enemies, you could probably still clear this half with no trouble whatsoever. One other nice thing about this abyss is that this time around we have a decent amount of enemies in every chamber, aside from the Magukenki, of course, and so you can get by with using less energy recharge. As you may be able to see with this run, I gave my Zhengling the Dragon's Bane instead of the Favonius Lance, so you may be able to build for a little bit more damage or use a damage weapon instead of an energy recharge weapon, especially for the second half. As for the first half, you will still have to deal with the Magukenki. As a bit of an aside, I decided to replace my Ayaka's Black Sword with the Emenoma Kageuchi that I refined all the way to 5, because at this point, why not? As I did want to see, if you weren't going to use a battery, how much would this help with her energy generation in fights like, say, the Magukenki. However, as I did say during the last Abyss runs, that I did want to try the Raiden team again, and as we are going to be getting Toma just after the next Abyss will reset, and from immediately seeing his kit, figured he would be a fantastic fit for Hu Tao, so I could finally have a team with her that I felt where every character was doing something significant. That is definitely what I plan to be trying out, to see if this weapon can actually give Ayaka the energy she needs without running another battery, and if Toma will finally give me a Hu Tao group that I am fully pleased with. Now for the third chamber, it's very similar to 2 Abyss cycles ago, but this time there are also Ruin enemies in the first wave of each fight as well. Now for the first wave, I would head towards one of the mechanical array enemies and just let the Ruin Hunter come towards you, and hopefully the other Ruin enemy will also do so. And at least one of these enemies will usually do their big ground AoE. So one thing I would potentially suggest doing is actually going a little bit past, so that you can bait out that AoE, return, try and wait for the third to pop his head up while throwing down some buffs, and then attempt to AoE them all down together, assuming yours don't mysteriously break free of your freeze. For the second wave, we have 2 ranged enemies and then a Ruin Guard, so you definitely probably want to go to one of the ranged enemies. After a few hits, they will likely dash away from you, so if you aren't freezing them from the get-go, definitely try to keep an eye out for that. You might even try to get one of them to dash back towards the other one so that you can AoE them down together, but for me, their dashing directions seem to be pretty erratic, and so fairly difficult to pull off. Though in future runs, I may try to see if I can get that down. And once again, of course, for whatever time that you can sit on your high damage character will mean you'll be able to have significantly more attack for when you throw it out. So if you're just maneuvering around or so on and so forth, definitely try to make sure that you are on the character you're going to be dealing the most damage with. Now for the first wave in the second half, we instead start with 2 ranged enemies and a Ruin Guard. However, the ranged enemies this time are much further apart, and so even if you got one of them to somehow dash closer to the other one, they would still be much too far apart for you to attack at the same time, aside from a few characters' ultimates. And so I'd probably just suggest heading towards one, throwing down your buffs and so on and so forth, while the Ruin Guard comes towards you, nuking the 2 of them down as fast as you can, and then going to the third. Also, if you can end the fight towards the southern part of the area, that will allow you to immediately start attacking the final wave of this abyss with 1 rune greater and 2 defensive mechanical array enemies. And for here, there's again not a whole lot to say other than just throw down whatever you have and try and kill them all at the same time. Now talking about the Abyss as a whole, I definitely think the first chamber is a lot easier than some prior Abysses we've had. The second chamber is extremely similar to 2.1's second chamber, with the second half having more enemies and 2 waves instead of both enemies simply being there from the get-go. And so this will definitely take longer, and because most of these enemies are ranged units, if you can bring a strong gatherer to this half as well, that will significantly decrease the time it will take you to clear this. The final chamber is honestly probably a little bit more difficult, which honestly comes as a surprise to me, considering last time we had that like 2.2 million health mechanical array, but simply due to how many enemies this time there are and having a number of ranged enemies that we can't really crowd control at all, does mean that this can take a decent amount of time. Now, I don't think it's much harder than last time, but I do think it does take a little bit more time. And certain characters won't be quite as useful as they were last time. Say with the mechanical array, because it's pretty much just one enemy that you have to attack. Characters with very strong single target damage, like say Hu Tao or Yoimiya, can work very well here, but for 2.2's Abyss, you're definitely going to need AoE, and so especially say Yoimiya, I think is going to struggle. But it would be interesting knowing what you guys think about the current Abyss. Do you think it's more difficult than last time, or do you think it's actually a bit easier? Though I do wonder if the following Abyss resets are going to be more difficult, as the current Abyss buff can be used by a good amount of characters to a decent effect, whereas the second, as you will only gain the buffs after you cast your burst, while still needing to be on the field with your ultimate full for 10 seconds, will for most characters be significantly less useful. And then the final buff, which just gives shockwaves, generally speaking isn't particularly great to begin with. So it might get more difficult, but at the same time, as usual, we might also get more used to the Abyss itself. And with that, I think we reached the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Look forward to seeing you again next time, and hope you all have a great day.